Would you like to say anything about our characters this evening? No? Yes? Or let them speak for themselves? Okay, so we welcome our character and our reader, and we'll ask them to go ahead and proceed.
A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor Pontius Pilate, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. When Jesus was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and on our children."
Testing. I am Pontius Pilate, the Roman governors whose authority ruled in the execution of Jesus. I didn't want to be the authority to decide his fate. I had questioned Jesus and found no reason, none, to sentence him to death like the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees were demanding of me. They could not sentence Jesus to death, but I could, and they knew this. Their counsel would condemn a man and say he was worthy of death, but they needed the final word from Rome itself to carry out the sentence. And so it was I, as governor of Rome, who had the final authority to execute Jesus. It was then I found out that Jesus was from Galilee, so I was relieved. As a Galilean, Jesus was not subject to my rule, but to Herod's. So I sent him over to Herod to be questioned. But Herod just happened to be in Jerusalem at the same time. I thought I was through with Jesus. But no, Herod too examined him and could find no reason to condemn him, as the religious leaders so desperately hoped. So Herod sent Jesus back to me, because there was no basis for the charges against him. He had done nothing to deserve death. Jesus was, again, under my jurisdiction. Should he live, or should he die? It was my ruling that would answer that question. And I wanted nothing to do with this man. Nothing. He frightened me. He was accused of claiming to be God. And what if he was? Do you think I was prepared to give the final word on his execution? Should I be the one to nail God to a cross? I was nervous and simply questioning him. So silently, so serenely he stood before his accusers as they hurled insults at him. He said nothing. He answered none of their charges. If I had known the prophets foretold the Messiah of God would lay down his life in silence like a lamb is silenced before it is slaughtered, I would have been even more terrified. terrified just like I was when my wife came to me, panic-stricken and shaking, told me of a dream she had suffered. She begged me not to have anything to do with that innocent man. Those were her exact words. That innocent man. As you can imagine, I was overcome with nervousness when I asked if he were a king, and he told me that he was, but that his kingdom was not of this world. What was I supposed to do with an answer like that? The chief priests were demanding Jesus' life for saying he was a king and for opposing taxes to Caesar. When I resisted condemning Jesus, the priests immediately threw Jesus' opposition to Caesar in my face, saying, "You're not a friend of Caesar if you let Jesus go. He's claiming to be a king." I suppose they were right. By claiming to be a king, Jesus was in a sense opposing Caesar, whom I was afraid of also. What am I to do? I didn't want to kill him. The priest did. I had decided to let him go. I wanted to let him go. But the jealousy of the priests wouldn't allow it. Of course they were jealous. Nothing could have been more obvious. The people were following after Jesus instead of them. The people were listening to Jesus instead of to them. And now they demanded Jesus' death so they could be done with him. His charges? The priest accused him of stirring up the people with his teaching. They accused him of inciting the people to rebellion. And of course, they accuse him of claiming to be God. And what if he is? What if he is God? There was one chance to alter the fate of Jesus. It is the custom of the Jewish people to have one prisoner released as a pardon at every Passover. The release is granted by me as governor. So I suggested to the crowd that Jesus be released instead of being condemned. To make sure they chose Jesus, I gave them the choice of Jesus or Barabbas, who was a notorious murderer. Of course they would choose Jesus. When I offered the freeing of Jesus, I used the name of Christ, meaning God's anointed, God's Messiah, God's deliverer, because this is exactly who Jesus was claiming to be. And do you know who they chose to set free? The murderer! How crazy is this? When I asked them what I should do with Jesus, they responded, "Crucify him!" It was then I washed my hands before the crowd in a bowl of water, and I said, "I am innocent of this man's blood." But then I turned Jesus over to be crucified. I condemned him without evidence, without reason, without anything. Such a spineless leader I was. This was my reputation before I came face to face with Jesus, and this is the reputation history remembers me by. I've always tried to keep the people from uprising at whatever the cost, and the cost today couldn't have been higher. And if this Jesus is who he says he is, God is about to be nailed to the cross. And I had the final say.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this Jesus as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis on your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." With one voice they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into the prison for insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." For the third time, Pilate spoke to them, "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and for murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns, and set it on his head. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on. Then they led him out to crucify him.
I am Barabbas. Jerusalem knows me well. Murderer, insurrectionist, and the criminal set free, Passover feast. It was custom of the Jews to pardon one prisoner at the feast. Who would ever thought it would be me as the one chosen to walk free? Especially when there were two choices, Jesus Christ or myself. His crime? He said he was God. And then, because I was chosen to walk free, to go anywhere I pleased, I walked out to the cross and watched him die. Agonizingly, a wretched, horrid death. Nailed up there in place of me. Because he said he was God. It didn't make sense. Even I, Barabbas, knew this. Jesus arrived in Jerusalem 5 days ago. I didn't see him because I was locked away in prison. But I heard him. They said he entered the city riding through the gates on a donkey. Picture that. It was then the crowds went wild, shouting with jubilation. They started shouting, "Hosanna! Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Their voices were deafening. I pressed my face against the bars of my jail cell. I heard the commotion coming from the streets. Hosannas echoing from the crowds. The word means save us. How strange. The crowds who glorified him only 5 days ago, they're now shouting, "Crucify him." Strange. Just doesn't fit. Even I, the murderer, knew this. I saw the nails being pounded into his flesh. Once again, I saw this because I was set free. And so I went there. Why were they doing this to this man? No one was crucified by being nailed to a cross. They were supposed to be tied to it. Just tied with ropes. Yet there they were. Pounding and pounding and pounding. Pound the nails right through him. It was sickening. Do you have a crucifix? One hanging in your house? Maybe a picture of Jesus hanging on the cross, usually depicted having some serene look on his face, maybe a trickle of blood on his hands, on his feet, maybe a little blood on his forehead, and the crown of thorns. I'm here to tell you, I was there. There weeping beneath him as he hung there instead of me. It was nothing like that. Jesus had been beaten severely. Not just beaten, flogged, whipped, slapped, spat on, hit him in the head over and over again with that wooden pole. And then they took the thorny crown and pressed it into his head. Have you ever pricked your finger on a razor-sharp thorn? Imagine what that would feel like, pressed into your temples. Think about that. Think about what Jesus looked like. This was after they were through beating him. And the nails had not been gone through yet. His mother was there to see this too. There she stood beside me, crying. From the 3rd hour till the 6th hour, she wept. I reached for her hand when Jesus looked down to speak with her. She trembled. This was her son. How could she endure hearing the jeers, mocking by the crowd? They hurled insults, one after another. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God. Even the religious priests in their fine robes, they stood there mocking him. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Funny how they acknowledged Jesus had saved others. I don't know much about religion. I don't wear the fancy robes. The flowing robes, all the priests, when they say they're holy. I've never even been to the temple to pray. But this I do know. What was going on here didn't make sense. Still just didn't fit. Once again, even I, Barabbas, the murderer, I knew this. But it happened. And then I understood. Jesus turned to a thief hanging next to him. He told him he would see him today in paradise. In paradise. When I saw it, the thief was going to the same place of glory that Jesus would. Then Jesus looked over the hatred beneath him, looked upon those who insulted him and beat him, and said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And suddenly it fit. Jesus had not only died instead of me, he died instead of all of us. Hosanna! Hosanna! Save us! From whom? From ourselves. As only he could. And I understood. He hung up there on my behalf. And he hung up there on yours. Not because he said he was God, but because he is. There were two choices the day the sky turned black. I, Barabbas, or Jesus, the Christ. And the crowd chose him. Thank God.